now 15 years later, when you look at, sort of what it takes for Varda to succeed in its business, we need to be able to get to orbit on a rocket. We need to be able to host, basically the manufacturing payload on a satellite. We have to be able to build these reentry capsules that bring those back down. There's a whole suite of these things that are just available now with significant commercial availability where it just no longer makes sense to be as fully vertically integrated.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. So, if you haven't heard yet, there's going to be a massive piece of Soviet-era space junk returning to Earth over the weekend. At the time of this recording, the European Space Agency is predicting that Kosmos 482 may arrive, and that's a nice way of saying fall and crash, back to Earth, possibly on Friday night, May 9th, or in the wee hours of Saturday, May 10th. Kosmos 482 is a probe the Soviet Union had intended to send to Venus. After the 1972 launch, the plan was for Kosmos 482 to go to the second planet and actually descend through that planet's mostly carbon dioxide atmosphere and land on the surface. Now, because the carbon dioxide atmosphere is much thicker than the one we have here at home, the descent vehicle was purpose-built. That descent vehicle is about 1 meter wide and weighs about 495 kilograms. It's also outfitted with a titanium heat shield designed to survive atmospheric pressures roughly 100 times more intense than Earth's. So it's not going to burn up like a shooting star. While the odds put the final resting place somewhere in Davy Jones's locker, if it does hit land, it could be in the most populous areas on Earth. Governments around the world are watching. Now, there's going to be another reentry of a man-made object this week, and it's also just about 1 meter wide. But this one's planned. That's Varda's W3 mission, which has an Air Force Research Lab payload aboard. The W3 will be coming into the atmosphere at roughly Mach 25, or 30,000 kilometers per hour. So before reaching its destination, it's going to deploy a parachute to slow down for a soft landing in South Australia at the Kaniba Test Range. I had a chance this week to catch up with one of Varda's founders, Delian Asparouhov, and the company's director of strategic partnerships and advanced concepts, Muk Pandian. Here's our conversation. Hello, Delian. Muk, welcome to the Downlink podcast.
Ooh, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Now, before we delve into what is an atmosphere-piercing technology, I'd love it if you guys could take a moment to introduce yourselves. And Delian, you're the president, so you really should go first.
Thanks. Well, thanks again for having me today. My name is Delian Asparouhov. I'm one of the co-founders over here at Varda Space Industries, president. Mostly focused on, some of our externally facing, sort of work. So business development, government relations, fundraising. I actually am somebody that wears, sort of a multitude of hats. And so in addition to being a co-founder of Varda, I'm also a partner at Peter Thiel's venture capital firm, Founders Fund, that has been known for investing in a ton of different companies that collaborate with the national security community, including companies like Palantir, Anduril, SpaceX, et cetera. And so definitely bring some of that heritage, I think, into Varda. And then heck, even for the sort of DC folks, also a co-founder of the Hill and Valley Forum, which we just hosted in DC last week with some great speakers like Jensen Huang, Alex Karp, Speaker Mike Johnson, Senator Ernst, ton of great people that attended in that. And so, excited to chat today.
Awesome. And Muk, what about you?
Yeah, hey, Laura. My name is Muk Pandian. I'm Director of Advanced Concepts here at Varda. Been with Varda for about 3 years now, and came in kind of the early days when we were looking at how to support the DoD business on the with our commercial capabilities. So, been working that ever since. Looking forward to talking about that today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Now, it's so great to have you both here. So let's dive into just what is Varda Space Industries, the 5 W's and H. The Air Force Research Lab may know Varda, and well, there's a wider space and defense audience that does not. So, Delian, could you kind of give us the nuts and bolts of what Varda Space Industries is?
Sure. When we founded the company about 4.5 years ago, it was explicitly actually around nothing related to what the Air Force Research Laboratory necessarily does. It was specifically formulated around this thesis that while there had been decades of work on everything from the International Space Station, the Space Shuttle, Skylab, that had shown that there was significant, sort of promise and benefits of processing various materials in the microgravity environment of low Earth orbit. Nobody had really commercially transitioned that work. And that was partially due to two things. One, those platforms where that research had been done were government run platforms that are not particularly well suited for commercialization. But two, sort of access to orbit was incredibly infrequent and expensive. And in 2020, Falcon 9s and other rockets were, making it so that access to space was very regular, but nobody had really solved the other half of the equation. And that was basically why we founded Varda, was to take advantage of the fact that, sort of shipping to space was now finally just shipping. In order to do that, we needed to basically build a small satellite plus reentry pod sort of vehicle where it had these two parts to host those types of manufacturing payloads on board, and the reentry pods to bring those materials back down. We primarily, with our commercial business, focus on the pharmaceutical industry. And so there, what we're doing is we're taking current drug assets that have already been discovered, some of which may be in clinical trials, some of which may be already commercial. And when you're up in microgravity, you can basically change how that drug crystallizes in the form of it. And what that ends up doing is it actually changes how that drug performs in your body. So, one example of, sort of the same drug having different effects in your body based off the crystal form is, aspirin. There's two types of it that you might see in the pharmacy. You might see slow release aspirin for arthritis and fast release aspirin, for headaches. In both of those sort of cases, it's the same molecule. It's still aspirin in both of them, but that difference in crystalline structure is what changes how it performs basically in your body. And so we do that, but for more complex compounds, think, taking a cancer drug that previously was a 4 to 6 hour intravenous drip and instead turning that into something that's a syringe that you can take in the comfort and safety of your own home. Or taking something that was previously only shelf stable at minus 20 degrees centigrade and now making it room temperature shelf stable. And so that's primarily what we focus on the commercial sort of side of the business. As we were building up our vehicle and the platform for our commercial use case, we started to see that there was sort of a ton of interest from a variety of different sort of users, and in particular in both the national security and civil space community. On the national security side of things, it was sort of what you alluded to with the Air Force sort of research laboratory, where we are transiting through a hypersonic regime, unlike what any other sort of reentry vehicle transits through. If you think of vehicles like the Space Shuttle, Dragon, Starliner, so the Soyuz capsule, all of those have sort of humans on board, and unfortunately or fortunately, humans are pretty squishy and filled with lots of water. And so we're not so good at sort of ripping sort of 8 Gs for 15 sort of minutes straight. Turns out we all die if that happens. But a pharmaceutical powder on board, that
That's
does just
important
fine.
to know, right?
It's true. Yeah. Do not curl up in a ball and try and fit yourself in a Varda capsule. You unfortunately, even if you could curl up and hold your breath for 15 minutes, unfortunately, you're not going to survive those G forces. But it turns out that sort of hypersonic regime that we transit through is exactly the type of regime that sort of next generation reentry vehicles, hypersonic boost glide missiles, all transit through. And so we sort of act as a effectively hypersonic wind tunnel where we can take various components, payloads, next generation heat shield materials, and go test them in the actual flight-like environment, right? You're not just reliant on just, sort of models and ground-based, sort of wind tunnels that are still not fully representative of the actual flight environment. And so, as we always like to say, test like you fly like you test, and we actually offer that. And then the third area is around allowing other people to do microgravity research, but off of these, sort of current, sort of platforms. As you may have seen, the current administration is starting to signal, at least from the White House, that they would like to start to deprioritize ISS activities. There's a significant backlog of academic researchers as well as sort of commercial companies that are looking to do more basic sort of science in microgravity that currently don't really have a platform they can go operate on. And so sort of Varda offers that use case where we're obviously doing our pharmaceutical commercialization with our own platform, but we're also happy to offer it to folks that are doing basic research in other categories for flight. And so we built this initial sort of W series, but it turns out it has a sort of multitude of different use cases.
So, Muk, why don't you take this moment to actually explain what is the W series? I mean, what is the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Delian mentioned, the W series was built on the idea that now you have reusable rockets and access to space is becoming just, shipping. What could we go do there, and what could we go build there that really enables this next generation of microgravity research? So the W series is designed around the most frequent, highest cadence, most reliable rocket that's going up. It's the SpaceX Falcon 9. This rocket is pretty big, but they actually compartmentalize into ride shares. So we've designed our vehicle to fit within a ride share volume of that. It means we can scale pretty quickly when there's like over 100 of these things going up a year, but we can fit over 20 vehicles on a single launch vehicle. So really, like, we've designed it for the highest cadence, most lowest cost way of getting to space and performing these mission sets.
Well,
Um,
wait, don't
yeah,
don't keep going yet though, because you said
yeah,
you could put in 20 of these into a fairing, right? All right.
and we will
So,
one day.
well, there you go. Let's do more than hope, right? But how big is this? Like, what are you really talking about? Like, because you've got to think of, we've got listeners, and so, how would you describe that so they could see it in their mind's eye?
Yeah, definitely. So the vehicle is two actually vehicles in one. It's a satellite bus that has all the power and the propulsion, the things that keep it on orbit, and then a reentry capsule. That's the thing that has the experiment in it and is the piece that's meant to survive and come back to Earth and recover under parachute. That reentry vehicle is about a meter in diameter. You think about like meter sphere, and then a couple meters long for the overall vehicle itself. So human size.
Just
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
Yeah. All right.
exactly.
Well, but you guys are also doing something really interesting and different in how you're approaching, your business model and getting your vehicles to space and back from space, right? Because you guys use Rocket Lab satellite buses and you get your ride to orbit with SpaceX. Why this model? Because that's a lot of partnerships, that's a lot of contracts, and that's even before we start talking about the payload, right? There are some other players in this space that vertically integrate, which means they do everything in-house, from building the satellite bus to launch, but not you guys. Is this, on purpose, A, and B, is this really the way of the future?
Yeah, I think as you see certain, sort of markets and supply chains mature, you tend to see this shift from sort of verticalization to, sort of horizontal, sort of players. If you think about it in the context of aerospace, in 2008 and 9, as SpaceX was starting to scale into the Falcon 9 program, had the early days of, sort of Dragon starting to be ideated, Starlink a few years later, there weren't really commercial providers for, sort of any of those. And so they had to basically vertically integrate in order to be able to perform, sort of their business. Fast forward, sort of now 15 years later, when you look at, sort of what it takes for Varda to succeed in its business, we need to be able to get to orbit on a rocket. We need to be able to host, basically the manufacturing payload on a satellite. We have to be able to build these reentry capsules that bring those back down. There's a whole suite of these things that are just available now with significant commercial availability, where it just no longer makes sense to be as fully vertically integrated. Like, in theory, if Varda wanted to make its business model work in 2005, yeah, we would have had to go build the rocket, the satellite, the, sort of processing equipment, the reentry capsule, et cetera, all from the get-go. That also probably would have meant that we would need to raise like over $1 billion in order to get to market.
Well, you do have billionaires on speed dial, so
It's true, but no billionaire co-founders. So, we're still working on that. We're going to become billionaires via Varda rather than before Varda. But it allows us to focus on a basically narrower segment of the technical challenges. Now, look, over time, as the sort of company continues to progress, there may be times where we do choose to more fully vertically integrate. But to at least get to that first initial, sort of MVP, it was important for us to just take off as bite-sized of a chunk of the problem, sort of as possible. And as we start to optimize the scale of how much we're producing these things, the costs of it, it'll be sort of a buy versus build trade across every single component, of the stack. But I don't think we'll be, making rockets anytime soon.
And I'll add one thing to that. It's also the risk paradigm here, right? So why would you buy off more technical risk than you have to? We are 2 for 2 for missions right now. Going to be 3 for 3 in a little bit here. And this is on a mission that is a very challenging one. We're we're screaming in at 18,000 miles per hour going through the atmosphere. Like, it is a very challenging thing to survive. And, we've nailed it because we've really thought through the technical risk and how we take robust supply chains and leverage those in order to, get to speed and get flying.
And focus basically on what your mission is, which is to reach those speeds, and yet at the same time, deliver your payload back down to the surface of the Earth without breaking anything. So let's get into your space heritage, right? Because it's just been over a year since the W1 mission. You've had another, and W3 is still in orbit. But to explore the W1 mission a bit, it was a pharmaceutical manufacturing experiment. Now, I know you just spoke about it a bit at the top, but I think it's really interesting to point out that it was with a company called Improved Pharma, which is a pharmaceutical development services company out of Indiana. Now, briefly, what did that first mission prove in that particular case? Because if I'm not mistaken, this was for an HIV drug, and it could have huge implications in terms of its potency and its predictability and its reliability, its resiliency. I mean, all the C's, right? I mean, that's a pretty interesting thing, no?
Yeah, we chose to work on ritonavir, is the name of that sort of molecule, HIV antiviral. Partially because if you remember, earlier in the podcast, I was mentioning that when you have different crystalline forms of the same drug, you can have very different attributes, right? I gave that example of aspirin. Ritonavir actually had a challenge where in the mid 90s, a sort of new crystalline form ended up showing up after the drug was already on the market on some of their manufacturing lines. And that new crystalline form, even though it was the same molecule, made the drug completely insoluble in patients' bloodstreams. So basically, it didn't break down. It made it so that it was no longer effective. And so all of the clinical outcomes that sort of drug was able to impact just fell off a cliff. It was basically having no effect on the sort of end patients. And so the FDA ultimately ended up having to recall that drug and remove it from the commercial market. And it was the first time, actually, that the FDA ever had to take that type of action that was due to a sort of crystallization challenge, a net new sort of crystalline form. And so part of why we chose the drug is because it had such historical significance in that, if the goal of microgravity is to solve these crystallization challenges, let's go tackle the, most famous drug that everybody studies in grad school that had those types of challenges. So in that first mission, we had sort of couple different goals. The first was go show that we can sort of crystallize sort of ritonavir in a better form than the challenges it had in the mid 90s. And two, show that once we're done with that crystallization, that we can basically lock in those benefits and keep them all the way through down to the ground. And so that means that during reentry, even though the temperature of the surface of the heat shield was hotter than the temperature of the surface of the sun, we were able to maintain room temperature all the way through down onto the ground. And the worst environment that the drug ended up seeing was actually in like the FedEx truck that it was shipped out of after the reentry. And so we're super pleased with it. It was more of a demonstration proof point than something that's like immediately going to go into patients, into the clinic, but it was a really great first step for us on that commercial pharmaceutical case.
It's an amazing story. So I'd like to follow on with that, though. How big is the demand for other types of research like that, right? Because I've heard that you are participating in the upside from some other drug patents and sales, that there is innovation in there. It's also a long-tailed and risky sort of endeavor, which space is that too, right? I mean, you're not going to get your return on investment for at least 7 years, probably 10. And I know I've heard you speak in other forums, and I know that you're well aware of that. But this is also a long-term kind of bet too, no?
Yeah, it's definitely not going to be, sort of overnight in terms of, showing the, sort of potential and impact of the technology. But I think what helps is there are a lot of just, sort of secular tailwinds across various industries that are helping Varda on the, sort of pharmaceutical side of things. The sets of drugs that have crystallization challenges is, sort of growing more and more as drug developers start to develop more and more complex, basically pharmaceuticals, and that leads to, sort of more challenges. I think the other, sort of area that is obviously providing a ton of tailwinds is defense and aerospace tailwinds, both from, launch becoming more regular, but generally they're being much more influenced from the Defense Department and civil space on sort of next generation capabilities, and so that's providing this initial sort of set of sort of customer base that we're able to sort of build on top of, such that we can continue to take the big swing in pharmaceuticals. And so,
Oh,
as an
we'll get to
example,
defense in just a second. So you just
yeah,
hold that thought, young man. All
yeah,
right. Because really, when I was looking in your background very particularly, and after you got that fellowship, right, for $100,000, and you developed that app, Nightingale, right? So I can see that there's a real through line in terms of trying to find ways to, help medicine and help diagnosis and help that along. But what I'm really interested in is, what was that light bulb moment for Varda, right? I mean, it's really different than developing an app. It's space. I mean, it's got coding. I get you. It's gonna, draw on all of the things that you've learned from your life, from your family, all of that. But it's space, right? So now here you are, and it's got a huge, long time frame for that return on investment. But you've taken the plunge. So what was the actual spark?
yeah. I admit, I've always been a sci-fi and aerospace geek, and so I'd been studying the field for a long time, thinking about how one day I could enter it. And I got really obsessed with these sort of like industrial space use cases, everything from asteroid mining, lunar ice mining, and obviously in space, sort of low Earth orbit manufacturing. And started to read all the papers about it, the business models, and I'd like to think that I've built up some level of sort of commercial sense of sort of what can be turned into sort of business. And to me, it was very clear that of all the industrial use cases that people had hypothesized, low Earth orbit and space manufacturing felt like it was sort of the first model that was going to be able to be sort of commercialized. And so I originally, honestly, sort of approached it as an investment thesis from Founders Fund, and the sort of light bulb moment that made me really sort of consider it seriously was a combination of both sort of Falcon 9 rockets in 2019 launching and landing sort of regularly, but also some data sets that were published from the International Space Station by top 20 pharmaceutical companies. And so, as an example, Merck took one of their blockbuster cancer drugs, Keytruda, up to the International Space Station and basically showed that they could improve the crystalline form of that drug in microgravity. But there just wasn't really a path forward to go commercialize that, because again, this was done on a sort of government run research sort of laboratory rather than a commercial platform that could take that into the clinic. And so,
And it's got a really different cadence too, right? Because if you're going to the ISS, I mean, you've got to vie for a space in the racks. You've got to get everything ready, and then who knows when it's actually coming back. And I mean, you guys are, kind of being the FedEx of, medicine and space all at once, right?
yeah, what I realized is the only way to do this is you had to be both the like medicine provider and the FedEx all in one company. Otherwise, it wasn't going to work, because our pharmaceutical partners need to have consistency on delivery. They can't have a 2.5 year long turnaround that gets delayed because Boeing has some issues or there's geopolitical tensions with Russia. Those are all things that feed into the ISS schedule that these commercial companies don't want to have to deal with in their supply chain. And so we realized that we just needed to build something that was fully independent. It could go up on those Falcon 9s that are going up 100 times a year. We could control our own schedule. We could control our own cadence, but still do that sort of top tier pharmaceutical work.
And Mook, what made you jump from years with Northrop Grumman, right? You were there for a good serious period of time, and it was in the air domain, but you jumped into startups in space. How's the plunge been so far?
It's been pretty incredible, actually. But I think I've always been similar to Delian. I've always been an aerospace geek. When I graduated with my engineering degree in '06, space has always been cool, but working in space has not always been cool. Back then, it was like billion-dollar programs that were going nowhere, 10, 15-year cycles that could easily be mothballed. So I think, actually pretty quickly within like 6 or 7 years of working at Northrop, I started getting to be part of that space portfolio. And what I recognized though was, there's a lot of big company, like a lot of things a big company like that can go do. But really a lot of that can be done by small companies now. And I was actually consulting for a couple of years after leaving Northrop for some small businesses.
And you were way out there in Nowheresville in
Yeah,
California, man. I gotta hand
know.
it to you. That's woof.
Yeah. And yeah, during that time, I pitched actually Will Brewy, Delian's co-founder, on like just consulting here, and this team blew me away. The like mission blew me away. I think the art of the possible about what we could go do with everything that we were developing here. And yeah, I haven't looked back since. It's been great.
So, as I said earlier, and as you guys alluded to earlier, AFRL knows Varda. And if I'm not mistaken, right, the W3 mission contains an AFRL payload. I'm not sure what you can tell us about it, but what can you tell us, right? Maybe about the contract. It's an indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract, an IDIQ in parlance. Um, that's pretty remarkable for such a young company to have.
Yeah, so we've been really fortunate with all of our government partners, and we don't like to go into details on specific government partners and what they're flying for their own sensitivities, but can definitely talk like broadly about what they care about, what this government customer set cares about when it comes to testing on Varda. Um, Existing test infrastructure in these high hypersonic and reentry conditions is just not adequate, and as a nation, as we are trying to get faster with things, whether that be the systems that Delian was talking about earlier, like boost glide systems. We don't have enough infrastructure really to support those things. One, you can't. It's not just a cost thing; it's actually a physics thing. There, you can't get coupled effects in these really high above, like Mach 10, Mach 12 conditions. You can't get those coupled effects, the aerodynamics, the thermodynamics, and the chemistry on the ground. You have to flight test. We just can't couple those things together here. And there's been billion-dollar programs that have failed without this information. So we are plowing new ground with gathering this environmentals of what it's like to travel through reentry and be able to design next generation vehicles that can go and be more successful and support the nation's mission set.
And I've heard that you have an eye to participate in the Next Generation Missile Defense Program, or Golden Dome. How do you envisage that participation exactly?
Yeah, so this is a massive undertaking for the nation. The amount of systems that are going to be developed it's not just what we've got now and more of that. There's going to be next generation technologies that have to be developed, and all of those are going to need to be tested. They're neither going to be tested against assets that are flying at these very, very high speeds and odd trajectories through the space environment. And testing is going to be a critical part of everything we do as far as the advanced Golden Dome capabilities, and we really want to support that. That's a big part of our overall objective to support, building those next generation capabilities with test.
Do you have a specific example you could give that you say, hey, this is kind of what we mean by that?
Yeah, I think there'll be more to come there, I'll say, but you can think about ground tracking sensors and things like that, space tracking layers, and just not getting a lot of opportunities to see something like this. They could simulate it, but how often do you see something screaming through the atmosphere at Mach 29? So those types of testing and be able to support that is where we hope to lean into.
So, where are you now in funding, right? I mean, you've got space heritage, you've got an IDIQ defense contract. Those are really big boxes to tick. Are private equity investors knocking on your door? I mean, do you have a desire or a plan to go public?
Yeah, so to date, across our seed, Series A, and Series B, we've raised a little over $150 million since the company's inception. Definitely, plan to sort of continue to grow the company, and obviously, we want to be an independent company, and over time, one that can be sort of public on the public markets. There will probably be more rounds of sort of private financing before we get there, and I do think there's been a lot of interest from a variety of players, given everything that you just articulated. There's sort of few people in the world that go from a sort of pitch deck, business plan, and renders to sort of vehicles that are actually flying, customers that are actually happy, and some real progress being made according to the timelines that we promised. Plenty of people sort of make renders, but very few people actually fly hardware successfully. And so, we're excited to continue to make that progress and hopefully one day go public.
And just because you also are our partner with Founders Fund, I've also got another question from the Downlink podcast Space Economist, and that's George Pullen. And he was really generous with his time to help me prepare for this interview. So I would like to ask his question. And his question is, what's holding back all of the private equity dry powder from coming into the space industry? We've seen more VCs get involved in the last few years, but space is expensive. And $1 billion or even a $5 million VC check doesn't always go far enough. And certainly not in the way that real private equity activity in this space industry perhaps would or maybe even should. And we'd love to know what your opinion is on that.
I actually think this is probably one of the, highest times of, sort of interest from the, sort of private investment community into aerospace that we've ever, sort of seen. You have obviously, sort of high flyers like SpaceX that are, making phenomenal, sort of progress on a pure fundamentals basis in terms of revenue, hardware progress, but, continuing to obviously push things forward with Starship. And there's, sort of almost semi-infinite demand for equity in the company. But at the same time, even for some of the sort of mid-stage and smaller players, there's been a ton of interest as well, right? If you look at some of the folks that SPAC'd in the 2021 time period, that maybe struggled for a few years when there was a bit of a dearth of capital interest, a lot of those are trading, at all-time highs or above, and they're continuing to make a ton of progress. And so you're seeing that translate through on the private capital market side of things too. I think just like in the sort of past month, I think there's been 3 different rounds announced over 150 sort of $1 million across various sort of next generation aerospace players. I think that trend is going to continue. And so if anything, the sort of potential risk right now is there's such an oversupply of sort of capital in this field that that ends up funding business models that don't have a path to sort of exit or liquidity for the investors, and that causes a bit of a crash and a hangover after so much liquidity. And so if anything, right now the potential risk is that there's too much liquidity and interest from investors in the aerospace community.
And here's my last question, right? Where is this going? What's the next offering or platform? Where will you be in 10 years after you first turned on the lights, which was in 2021? So that would make it 2031, right?
Yeah, I think, the goal by then would just be, on the commercial side, that there are, sort of pharmaceuticals that were fabricated and formulated in space that are in the clinic being delivered to patients is sort of the one-liner goal there. On the, sort of architecture and operations and cadence, I think the goal is, today, launch is seen as a very common endeavor. I used to, sort of get up super excited to watch the SpaceX live streams and watch the rockets land. At this point, it's so common that it just feels like another day activity, and it's like the equivalent of watching a 747, take off from LAX. Not that interesting. Hopefully we can basically just make reentry as common as launches today, where nobody's that interested in tuning into our live streams because we've made reentry so boring. And because it's boring, it's this reliable, USA-owned orbital infrastructure that enables a thriving orbital economy for our nation that allows us to sort of create a lily pad to set off into the rest of the solar system. And so that's sort of our goals by 2031.
I have one last cleanup question. What does the W in W1 or W2 or W3 actually mean? I mean, is it whiskey? Is it WTF? I mean, what is W?
I think it's one of those, sort of age-old questions of the universe. Everybody's, sort of wondering it, but nobody has quite the answer. And so I encourage your audience to go search deep within their souls to find that answer. Perhaps it stands for 42.
All right. Thank you guys so very much for joining me on the Downlink podcast.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us. Good talking.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Varda Space. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Varda Space. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.